Welcome to Geopolitics Demystified. I'm your host, S.L. Kanthan. Today we have a very, very distinguished guest, a three-star general from the Air Force, and that is Mr. Matheswaran, who's also the Air Marshal. And we'll talk to him about a lot of different wide topics related to India, about the economy, geopolitics, relations with China, multipolar world, etc. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Kanthan. It's a great pleasure to be with you, and I enjoy your, information flow in the Twitter one enormously.
Thank you so much. In the U.S., the presidents, they give a speech once a year, and they call it the State of the Union. So, well, if you were to give a State of the Union about, for our country, India, what would that be? And what are its strengths, weaknesses, and the opportunities right now?
Well, I think, firstly, let's look at, there are enormous opportunities and strengths that are, very obvious to all of us. First thing is, let's look at the positive side of the population. We've already become the #1 country as far as the population is concerned. We are the most populous country in the world, having overtaken China last year, 1.45 billion Indians in a land mass which is about 1/3 of China's size. But that is really not the correct indicator. If you take the richness of the land and if you take the resources that are available in the land, then India is enormously gifted. Whether we are using it efficiently is a different issue. For example, the arable land in India was at one point of time 80%. It's come down to 60%. But China has never had more than 24 to 25% of its land as arable land. That probably in area comparatively may equal in what we are doing. But the country is far more blessed with natural resources and many other factors. But in the area of population, we are the youngest nation in the world, with 65% of our population in working age groups. So the demographic dividend is a huge opportunity for India. We will have this demographic dividend available to us right till 2050, 2060 timeframe. From when onwards, we will actually be aging quite fast. I mean, that's there in most other countries where literacy improves, people are more aware and better knowledge comes in, families become, nuclear, lesser number of children, and all that catches up. But at the moment, we have a massive demographic dividend. We are already 20 years into it, and we probably have another 20 to 30 years available. This is a huge advantage. Second, as Indians, are quite naturally gifted when it comes to education to be able to learn from different cultures and civilizations and getting into the sciences and engineering part of it. And that's why Indians are doing, like you all are doing, exceptionally well all over the world. There's something wrong if you're not doing as well. In India is a issue related to the government policies, environment, and other issues. The other strength now is, ever since we liberalized our economy in 1991, there's been a great push for economic growth in the country. And therefore, we are growing. And we will be the fastest economy that will grow for next, I would say, 30 to 40 years at an average of 5 to 6%. The question of utilizing the demographic dividend will lie on how, there's one more research assistant who's joined it. The one will depend on how we actually exploit in terms of creating opportunities for employment and building skill levels and exploiting the potential that is there in the huge young population that we have. Unfortunately, that has been an issue. So let's come to the economic growth. We will be continuing to grow at 5 to 6% despite various flaws in the government policies. So that is a given. if we have good policies, we probably can reach out to grow at a rate of 8% to 10% as China grew for 30 years in that process. That is an issue that's missing in India's strategic planning and strategic continuity as far as the national growth process is concerned. There is a problem there. But nevertheless, we are at $3.9 trillion today by the best estimates. And we will probably by 2050, we will touch $22 trillion or $24 trillion. And by 2070, we are likely to touch $50 trillion. These are all the, various estimates from Goldman Sachs and the other, analytical institutions. This is a huge opportunity for us, massive opportunity. But where are we? What is the state today? In terms of industrial manufacturing is concerned, our manufacturing is just about 13 to 14% of the GDP. It hasn't changed from 2010 to now. It hasn't changed. If anything, it was 15% to 13%, it's come down. And that, is an indicator of trouble for us, because when you have a massive young population, if employment opportunities are not adequate, it'll create dissatisfaction. We are growing on other areas. The exports are growing, the agriculture output is growing, and software industry is growing in a big way. But industrial manufacturing is mandatory to give more jobs, to create more jobs, to be able to create skills in the people, and also to drive innovation. Your innovation cannot depend on software alone. It has to be on many other areas of engineering disciplines and production disciplines. And that is a huge weakness that we have. And the government is not able to address, despite 10 years of massive opportunity that they've had so far after the change of government in 2014. That's one area we need to look at. In terms of overall global opportunities, when you become the third or second largest economy over the next 50 years, it should reflect on the quality of living, standards of living of the people. Per capita GDP needs to move into a higher level. We are still at the lower end, $2,300 per capita GDP, as compared to China today, which is probably pushing beyond $15,000 per capita GDP. And that's a huge difference. And that creates inequalities as well. The other weakness I would say is, while we are creating enough opportunities for innovation, individual entrepreneurship, etc., we got to be careful about American-style capitalism, which actually creates monopolies and huge inequalities in the society. And that's already showing up in India. We probably, over the last 15 years, we've become more unequal. And the differences between the lower segment of the population and the few rich people who own much of the country's resources is starkly visible. And that's, we are simply aping the capitalism of the American side, which is not a good thing at all for us. So opportunities are huge. We are moderately growing well. But I think if we manage it well in terms of strategic guidance, strategic planning, and a long-term continuity, we probably can grow much faster than this.
Absolutely. So what would you say are the top 3 things or 5 things that we have to do to improve manufacturing and to make India the next China, or maybe somewhat like the next China?
Well, what has happened in history and how China has capitalized is also, it's a credit that must go to the national leadership of that country, which they have planned. And, so the learning process first comes from accepting where we are in certain levels. The world, the modern world, particularly Eurocentric world that's been in existence for the last 500 years, is quite ruthless. So when they transfer, or when they actually give you capabilities in certain areas, they take their pound of flesh without actually giving you controls over certain areas. And therefore, how do you actually create value addition when you now industrialize in a big way and then get into the market with your cheaper products with value additions which are unique to our country? that's where I think we should have actually followed the what's known as the ladder of industrial production process. When you start at the bottom, then you just have to copy and produce, which we did in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. But later on, you need to actually bring in value addition by looking at various formats of engineering strategies, which inclusive of the reverse engineering, inclusive of technology diffusion, addressing your education, feeding your academia and industry, coupling them and then feeding them into industrial production, capabilities. All that process should have been done. And therefore, we need to actually look at where we've missed out in terms of mistakes that we made in our strategies. And this is one of the areas that I covered in a report that I gave to the government before my retirement, is that in India, I mean, this is a lesson we also need to learn from the US as well, and which I think Chinese have done very well, is that the intercoupling of industry, research, academia should be very, very close. And if you go into any of the Indian institutions, other than probably the IITs, most other universities do not have adequate coupling with the industry. That also reflects poorly on the industry. Industry's investment in R&D is extremely low. For example, the R&D investment as a share of GDP in India last year was 0.7%. China's was 2.4%. The US was 2.8%. But what is more interesting, and an observation in this, is that 70% or more than 70% of that investment in India comes from the government, state. The private industry's contribution is less than 30%. In China, the private industry's contribution is nearly 80%. In the US, the private industry's contribution is 87%. And that reflects, where we are going wrong in these processes. So I think we need to address education, your technical education, skill developments, your industries, encouraging through various policies by forcing them to invest in research and development, and of course, then bring out products with our value additions to be able to compete in the world market. We are not competitive enough in the world market in manufacturing areas, particularly.
Yeah. I mean, when I look at all the people going to college, they're either focused on software or they want to go into management. And I don't see a whole lot of people studying manufacturing, supply chain, logistics, and all that sort of stuff. And then also, to be really good in manufacturing, we need a lot of PhD people with background in chemistry, material science, and those kind of areas that don't seem to be very popular.
Absolutely. Like in Germany, if you're an engineering student, your final year goes into internships or apprenticing with the industries, and you get a hands-on experience. That kind of a practice is far and few in between amongst Indian colleges and industries. So as a result, there are enough studies that have actually been done, which reflect that the usability of Indian engineers who come out of their universities or colleges, 70% of them are not directly usable in any industry as of today. They have to be retrained, in the industry. And therefore, industries are reluctant to, look at that option as well, depending on, and Infosys anyway has a program, and that's an IT industry. Even then, they use their, once the people are taken into the Infosys, they have a training program in Mysore, which runs for 1 year to retrain them and get them on to the standards that they need. That shows where we are in this area. On the other hand, we'll talk about China when we come to that, but China's addressed the education part, science and technology and R&D as one of the 4 modernization objectives that Deng Xiaoping laid. And this is something we are constantly revising. We are constantly doing various committee reports, various issues have been done, but there's a lack of clear strategic continuity and strategic focus in our process.
So what do you think about vocational colleges, vocational training?
Extremely important. In fact, we were in the Peninsula Foundation. We were actually in talks with the local United Nations Development Program officials, and where we are wanting to do a few discussions on the education part, which is, and I spoke to quite a few of the principals of schools. There is hardly any emphasis on vocational skill developments in the schools. And it is not that it wasn't there in Indian schools before. I go back to my own schooling, which was a military school and boarding school. You had your crafts classes, you had your, modeling classes. These are part and parcel of your entire, training curriculum. When you moved on to, of course, I moved to the National Defense Academy, you had your engineering drawing, you had your molds to be made, you had your machining to be learned, welding, you learned these processes. And somehow these seem to be now, everybody is so focused on exams and marks that these skills are not being developed. And that's one of the serious flaws in our system. Second is the idea, I suppose it comes from all families, the pressure and everything, is that he's like a blinkered horse. He just runs from school to college to his university till he finishes his master's or PhD. Only then he looks at what skills do I have and where do I go. Right? So, unlike in most other countries, and I suppose there's also fallout of the huge competitive process that exists in India because of the population. In other countries, people finish their schools, they have a decent vocational skills, they work somewhere, earn some, do a bit of earning, and then refund themselves for their undergraduate education or even master's education. So there is no pressure on doing these immediately. They learn to work. And that gives you maturity, that gives you a lot of experience. It makes you look at the world in a different way. And then probably, they become better when they do their masters and when they do move on to the higher education after that. Somewhere, I think this culture needs to be brought into our country.
Wonderful. I agree. So now looking at the big picture, the world big picture, a lot of people are talking about a multipolar world. Our foreign minister, Shankar, loves to say that phrase a lot. So what does that mean to you? And what should be our strategy in this so-called multipolar world?
Well, Mr. Kanthan, we are at a very interesting time in world history. Like I said earlier, the world has actually been crafted by an Eurocentric power centers for the last 400, 500 years. And the two world wars are actually European wars. One of the scholars actually calls it as the Battle of the Empires. And at the end of 1945, it was still an empire. They changed the outward cosmetics, but it became a battle for empires of the Soviet Union and the American Empire, and the US won out. And now we are still living in largely an American empire. It is still an Eurocentric format. But the wars in Ukraine and the fallouts from Gaza have exposed, and plus the American intervention wars over the last 20 years, I think has given a lot of, realization across the global South that we've been taken for a ride for a long time, since 1945. And now I think we are, at a critical time. These two wars are shaping up the new world order, one. And second is, the world has realized that, the dollar cannot be a reserve currency for too long and should not be. That's one. And there has to be a greater say. Every major institutions of global governance have been dominated and controlled completely by the Western Europe and US. And that, what in effect it has done is, while decolonization has been put into practice and most countries have got their freedom on paper, but the economic controls and other controls have remained with the Western states. I mean, Africa is a classic example, and the series of rebellions and coups and revolutions that have happened in Western Africa used to basically throw and kick out the French colonial process. When the French were refusing to leave Vietnam, the US said, came into Vietnam saying we will help the Vietnamese to get rid of the French and become independent completely. But the anti-communist forces came into play. And all they did was they were helping the French for as long as they could survive. When they went out, the Americans intervened completely. And you had a 25-year war after that. The Vietnamese won out in the end, fine. But that has been the pattern. So when you look at power transition theory or Gansky's power transition theory, this is a power transition moment. It will play out over the next decade or two. And the rise of Asia, the center of gravity of, the economic center of gravity of the world is already moving to Asia, one. And of course, with China in the lead and the resurgence of Russia, India must play its cards well. So we are sort of neutral. We are watching very carefully. And Foreign Minister Jaishankar's statements are quite indicative of that. But we should also realize that we have to be strong to ensure that multipolar world order is the only solution for a equitable, rational global governance. And you need to be, India has to be one of the poles. And that one of the poles we cannot be unless we have complete control on the hard power resources that we need to have. And that is where I think, our strategies have to come in. We cannot be a great power and claim to be a great power if our military is dependent on imported technologies and imported weaponry. We have to be completely independent. And there, I think we can take a lesson from, the French. After the 1945, Charles de Gaulle clearly, put out a strategic directive, which is that the world is becoming an American world, and France will not be a lackey to the US. We will make sure that we are strategically independent. Strategic autonomy is all about that. And if you study that carefully, that will come out. The French are not dependent on technology to anyone, anywhere. But they may work with the others, they may collaborate. But in terms of technology, critical technology controls, if you're master of those critical technologies, then you don't have to be worried. Others will give technologies to you, they'll give you, they won't stop the resources, their supply chains will be, capable. That is what we need to understand. And therefore, the future of 21st century is heading towards a multipolar world order. And India cannot miss out its place on the high table. In fact, you can only be a great power when you're able to dictate rules and norms for the new world order, and not be only a rule taker or somebody dictates the rules to us. We have to be in that position.
So a few weeks ago, the US ambassador to India, he warned India that there's no such thing as strategic autonomy. Was it a threat? What was he saying?
Well, it's a sort of a veil threat, I would say. What does it really mean? He's saying either you align with us or we are not going to consider you as a friend. The US is friend of nobody. US is friend of its own interests. And therefore, as long as we serve their interests, they will be, making very, supportive statements. But the moment they say we are going to be following an independent decisions and independent path, we will support, we will have friends, we will support where our ideas are, congruent and we have, common interests. But at the end of the day, our national interest should rule supreme. And therefore, in the context of Ukraine, I think India's, although it's not articulated very explicitly that the problem has been created by the West, by its uncontrolled expansion of the NATO, I would say the NATO has no business to exist once the Cold War was over. Leave the Europeans to themselves, let the NATO be wound up, as just like the Warsaw Pact was wound up. And I think you wouldn't have had this war. And this is, I think everybody realizes this, although we are not articulating it so forcefully, but we are sending out a clear message now. After the initial hesitancy, I think we are sending out a clear message. We are neutral here, and we will not criticize the Russians, not because we are dependent on them for military equipment, but I think we see reason that the Russians are not fully at fault, in this war. And the Ukrainians have become a pawn in the geopolitical game of the West. And the West's duplicity is clearly evident in their statements with respect to the killings in Gaza. So I think India is realizing that carefully. And therefore, the statement that there's no such thing as strategic autonomy, well, he can give out a threat, but I think we've listened to this threat, these kind of threats over the last 75 years many times over. We shouldn't be worried.
Wonderful. So the last question is the big question. So we have our neighbor, China, and theoretically, if both countries work together, that's like almost 3 billion people, and we can make a huge difference for our countries, for the continent of Asia, and the world. So there are a lot of win-win opportunities. China is getting old, and they're also a little bit too rich. So the young people don't want to do a lot of the jobs that their parents and grandparents did. So that could be a great opportunity for us to become better in manufacturing. So, and, I mean, in terms of the defense military, if we two are not fighting, then we could be focused on a lot of other positive things. So, logically speaking, there's a lot to gain from working together. So, what would you say are the tools, the strategies, the diplomatic wisdom for the two countries to work together and resolve the issues?
Yeah, absolutely right, Mr. Kantan. I mean, China is our neighbor. We are Asian, big powers in Asia, and we are neighbors. You can't wish away that geographical fact, correct? And therefore, you can't have a great power on your doorsteps all the time as an adversary. We need to look at, and the paradox is our trade continues to grow. I mean, we've actually, I think this year or last year, we've even beaten the Americans. The US has the largest trading partner. China has exceeded that. I think $130 billion of trade we've done last year. So there is a lot to gain by a cooperative relationship between the two countries. That is one, is that the boundary dispute. We had an opportunity when Zhou Enlai in 1959, and that letter is available. If you go to the Wilson Center on their archives, we can actually see they've got a copy of that. He offered a very clear solution, which is Aksai Chin controls the Chinese logistical line into Xinjiang. And therefore, strategically, China was absolutely loath to actually leave that control to anyone else. So they were asking for the control of Aksai Chin, while they will not have any issues with the McMahon line anywhere else all across the border. This letter, Nehru just didn't even reply to it. The reason was that both the countries then became political prisoners of their own parliaments or their own constituencies. Because before that, Nehru had come and assured the parliament that not an inch of territory will be, allowed to be occupied by the enemy, and therefore we will recover everything. Well, 62 war is history, and a lot of lessons to be picked up from there. Now that we've modernized and we are great powers in our own right and nuclear weapon states, it's going to be very difficult to recover as promised in the parliament. What is the next solution? Is to actually talk meaningfully to each other and come to a acceptable via media, which meets both the countries' interests. And this is where I come to the changing, world order. The Western, world order is rooted in, it starts off with the Westphalian nation-state system that evolved in 1648. And you find that there's an increasing competition leading to massive number of wars, culminating in the world wars. And it's always a violence-oriented, international order that the West has always, created. The Eastern, on the other hand, the Eastern we are civilizational states, both China and India. And we go back to our relations for thousands of years. And therefore, I think there is an innate, nature to resolve these issues in a different manner. It's been done in the past. It can be done in a civilizational manner. And therefore, in 1945 to 1960s, when decolonization took place, the entire world, just because nation state was defined by the Western norms, and therefore we looked at rigid territorial definition of a nation state. We've always had fluid borders where both the countries' interests have actually been looked after. The Chinese empire model earlier, while empire, you can see geographical extent of the empire, but Xinjiang and Tibet were not completely, under control of the Chinese. As long as those sovereigns, they were pretty much sovereign. Those sovereigns made their annual ritual visit to the emperor, and then he took more gifts from the emperor rather than giving his tributes there. So these relationships in the history are quite different, and the world needs to change to this pattern of, living peacefully with each other rather than an aggressive mindset that's all the time looking at exploiting the resources of the other countries for their benefit. That's a Western model, and we need to look at the Eastern model. I think if both the countries look into their histories, look into their relationships, erase the colonial impositions of ideas, and look into their civilizational ideas, we probably can resolve our, problems better and coexist more peacefully. And Panchsheel is a very important direction in that context. But more importantly, for the world order, it is extremely important that India and China work together. India and China have to work together for the world order to be more rational and more equitable, as I said, looking after the other countries, smaller countries particularly. We don't need to capture territories. We don't need to enslave other countries. We don't have that kind of a mindset in our DNAs. And therefore, I think we need to actually take the lead in this entire process. That's the way I look at India-China relations.
Yeah, absolutely. And, so it would be also nice if there were more people-to-people exchange, like more with tourism and maybe studying, some Chinese studying here and some young people from here studying in China.
In a limited way, I've seen actually quite a few of the Chinese students. Some of them have come, very few numbers, to southern India to learn Tamil and study in some of these colleges. There was one or two in Coimbatore,
Oh, wow.
Chennai, and they were on the YouTube. It was quite interesting to see that. But I think we can go a long way. We've had trading relations for 2,000 years. We've had people-to-people exchange. Buddhism went from India to them. There's a lot to actually, and that's what Nehru was fascinated with, that idealism earlier. But he completely ignored the realism part of it. We have to be conscious of both sides. And that's the way I think we need to work. And there is, in terms of China as its growth story and its strategies that it followed, Deng Xiaoping's modernization programs, I think, and in the technology domain, like I said, you cannot be a great power unless you're technologically sovereign. In that domain, I think we need to probably study China, how they've achieved what they've achieved, and where we are actually, sort of faltering, and we need to plug those gaps. It is extremely important.
Yeah. China has a lot of bad history with Japan. But in the 1970s, Deng Xiaoping, he went to Japan and, he really worked very closely with the Japanese companies like Panasonic and all those other companies. And he said, hey, so you should move some of your manufacturing to China. We can learn a lot from you and we'll help you make more profits. So that's sort of pragmatism to set aside some of the historical the misgivings and bad things that happened, and to focus on pragmatism. That really helped China.
Absolutely. Even in the technology angle, I mean, they were quite, realistic, because they were starting from, rock bottom, and therefore they worked. They were not shy of, just license producing and supplying to the Western markets. The Western corporates were, salivating with the huge profit that they would make because of the lower, labor costs. But China worked in various phases. So by the time they came into the late 90s, every conceivable aerospace major in Europe and in US had their production plants in China. And when they now were inviting them to increase their presence and placing orders for Airbus aircraft, etc., the Chinese tied it up with various requirements of skill development. Between Boeing, Lockheed Martin, and Northrop Grumman, I think in one of their contracts, the Chinese actually, these three companies alone, as part of the contract, trained 100,000 Chinese technicians. And then in the third phase, they brought in their middle and senior level managers into the game. And by the time you come to the early 2000s, you find that lot is available for China to create their own, industrial capabilities, particularly in the defense area. And suddenly you jump from a third generation license produced MiG-21 or reverse engineered MiG-21 to a fifth generation aircraft in 2010. We need to ask the question, how did that happen? And when somebody says they stole technology, that's a nonsense. There is a skill, there is a research process, there is a skill development process, there is a technology diffusion that they've observed and benefited from it. And then they put together their strategy complete. In 1978, when China was modernizing, the industrial capability in defense, particularly in aerospace side, they were probably at no better than where we were, license producing the Russian aircraft. They were reverse engineering in a more bold manner than we hardly did any reverse engineering. But by the late 1990s, you found J-10, which looks like the F-16. And that, in my opinion, analysis that comes from the Lavi, Israeli Lavi, that had already plugged the gaps in their aerospace engineering capabilities. That aircraft was operational in the late 1990s. And by the 2010s, you have the J-20, which is a fifth generation fighter aircraft, which involves multiple domains of, expertise from metallurgy to design to, avionics and systems and radars, and weapon systems. All of that they've quite rapidly actually captured in terms of capabilities. Today, they're building the largest number of ships. They'll be the largest Navy in another 10 years' time with about 5 aircraft carriers, rivaling the US. And they will contest the US dominance on the seas. And they are building a fifth generation bomber, which is the H-20, which can actually fly off from their central air bases in the central part of the country down to Australia and back in one go. Okay, so that's the kind of capabilities. So I think it would do well for us to instead of focusing on the dispute on the border alone, to do a lot of intelligent studies on how China has achieved some of these and see where we've missed out somewhere. And that's an important strategic learning that we need to do.
Yeah, very well said. Very well said. Wonderful. Thank you for your time. That was very helpful. And we talked about the technology, manufacturing, geopolitics, multipolar world, China. So the audience will have a lot to digest from. And so hopefully we can have you back some other time in the future, and we can focus on some other topics.
We'll do that, Mr. Kantan. It was a great pleasure talking to you.
Wonderful. Thank you, sir.
We enjoyed the interaction. Thank you very much.
Thanks.